The invitation arrived 6 weeks before my 30th birthday. Not an invitation, really. A summons. The kind of document my father, Richard Vance Caldwell, had perfected over 40 years of corporate law. Precise, formal, utterly devoid of warmth. Embossed gold lettering on cream cardstock that weighed more than some novels. The kind of paper that announced, before you read a word, that the sender considered himself important. You are commanded to attend the celebration of legacy. Saturday, November 14th. The Whitmore Estate. Black tie. RSVP required. Commanded. Not invited. Not requested. Commanded. I sat at my kitchen table in the apartment I'd rented for 6 years, the one with the water stain on the ceiling and the radiator that clanked like a dying heartbeat, and ran my finger over the gold lettering until it left a faint metallic residue on my skin. 30 years old. The age my biological parents had been when they died. A fact I'd learned only 2 years ago, a fact that lived in a folder in my desk drawer, a fact that changed everything and nothing. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister, Victoria. Or rather, from her assistant, since Victoria didn't text personally unless cameras were present. Mother says you'll wear the navy dress. The one that doesn't show your shoulders. Don't embarrass us. I didn't reply. I never replied to Victoria's texts, or my mother's, or the increasingly rare messages from my father that arrived through his secretary with the subject line, Family Matters. I'd learned early that responses were ammunition, that engagement was surrender, that the only way to survive the Caldwell family was to become invisible until you became untouchable. But this invitation, this command, was different. It arrived 6 weeks before my 30th birthday. The birthday that mattered. The birthday that, according to the letter I'd received 2 years ago from a law firm I'd never heard of, would change everything. I hadn't told them? Of course I hadn't. For 2 years, I'd carried the knowledge like a secret pregnancy, growing heavier, more real, more dangerous with each passing month. The trust fund, the $50 million, the biological parents I'd never known, who'd died in a car accident when I was 11 months old, who'd left me everything in a trust that matured at 30. 2 years of silence. 2 years of watching my father deduct rent from my allowance, an allowance that stopped when I turned 18 and refused to study law. 2 years of working double shifts at a nonprofit legal clinic, of wearing clothes from thrift stores, of pretending I was still the charity case they'd always told me I was. Because they'd lied. They'd all lied. And on November 14th, 6 weeks before the truth became undeniable, my father had decided to hold a party. I called the law firm that afternoon, spoke to a man named Harold Chen, who'd been managing my trust since before I was born. The funds become available at midnight on your birthday, he confirmed. Until then, we can confirm the amount, the structure, the tax implications, but access? No, not until you're 30. And if I need to confirm ownership of assets before then? Assets? Real estate, corporate holdings, things I paused, choosing the word carefully. Inherited. A pause on the line. The sound of papers shuffling, of a man who'd spent decades managing other people's fortunes and had learned to recognize the weight of certain questions. Ms. Caldwell. Eleanor. May I call you Eleanor? Ellie. No one calls me Eleanor. Ellie, then. The trust your parents established, your biological parents, was comprehensive. They were cautious people. They understood that money without knowledge was dangerous. So they structured the trust to release information in stages. At 21, you receive the letter informing you of their existence. At 25, you would have received details of the principal. And at 30, access. Access. But between 25 and 30, certain information was made available upon request. Real estate holdings, corporate investments, assets that required active management. Another pause. If you're asking whether you own specific properties, I can confirm that. Within reason. I gave him the address, the Whitmore Estate, the 40-room mansion where I'd grown up, where Victoria had been born, where my father held his annual celebrations of himself. the house I'd always understood as his crown jewel, his proof of success, his fortress against the world. Harold Chen was silent for a long moment. Then, the Whitmore estate was purchased in 2019 by Caldwell Holdings LLC, which is wholly owned by Eleanor Vance, beneficiary of the Vance Family Trust. You, Ellie, you bought it. Through a series of intermediaries, but yes, legally, financially, absolutely, you are the owner. I sat in my kitchen, in my apartment with the water stain, and felt something shift inside me. Not joy, not triumph. Something harder, colder, more precise. The feeling of a door unlocking after years of pushing against it, only to discover you'd had the key all along. And his company? I asked. Caldwell Industries? Majority stake acquired in 2015. 73%. Through a subsidiary of a subsidiary. Your father, Richard Dwyer, has been CEO since before the acquisition. He reports to a board. The board reports to shareholders. The majority shareholder reports to you. Through intermediaries. Through intermediaries. As intended by your biological parents. They wanted you protected, Ellie. They wanted you safe from exactly the kind of people who would try to take what was yours. I thought of my father. Of the man who'd raised me, or rather, housed me, fed me, deducted expenses from an allowance that was itself drawn from a trust he'd never told me about. The man who'd called me adopted at every opportunity, who'd emphasized my difference from Victoria, who'd made sure I understood that I was charity, not family. He'd been working for me for 10 years, living in my house for 5. And he didn't know. Harold, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. I need you to send me something. All the documents, deeds, corporate filings, financial statements, everything that proves what I own. Can you do that? Of course. But Ellie, may I ask why? I looked at the invitation on my kitchen table, the gold lettering, the command. Because, I said, my father is throwing a party, and I need to know what I'm bringing. My mother called 3 days before the event, not to ask how I was, not to wish me happy early birthday, to issue instructions. The navy dress, Eleanor. The one with the high neck. Victoria will wear the emerald. She's the heir, after all. She should stand out. You'll stand behind her during the toast. Smiling. Grateful. Do you understand? Grateful, I repeated. For everything we've given you. Your father has been very clear. This celebration is about legacy, about family, about recognizing those who've earned their place. A pause, filled with the particular silence my mother used for emphasis. And those who haven't. I understood. I'd always understood, even when I was too young to name the dynamic. Victoria was blood. I was adoption papers. Victoria was legacy. I was obligation. Victoria was the future of the Caldwell name. I was the reminder of my father's brief, embarrassing first marriage, a marriage that had ended in death rather than divorce, which made it tragic rather than shameful, but still inconvenient. What my mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the adoption itself was a lie, or rather, a performance. My biological mother hadn't been my father's first wife. She'd been his mistress, a woman he'd loved, or thought he'd loved, until she'd died and left him with an infant he couldn't acknowledge without destroying his marriage, his reputation, his carefully constructed life. So he'd arranged the fiction. His wife, my mother, Patricia, would adopt the child. The biological mother's family would be paid generously to disappear. The truth would be buried so deep that even I wouldn't find it until I was 28, and Harold Chen's letter arrived with its revelation of parents I'd never known, a fortune I'd never imagined, and a life that had been stolen from me before I was old enough to speak. Ellie? My mother's voice, sharp with impatience. Are you listening? Yes, mother. Navy dress, high neck, behind Victoria, smiling, grateful. Good. And Eleanor, the voice softened, gained a note of performance, the warmth she used for public consumption. Your father has something special planned. A surprise. For Victoria, primarily. But you'll be mentioned. Acknowledged. It's important that you receive this graciously. Without what? Without making it about yourself. You have a tendency, Eleanor, to draw attention, to create scenes. Your father and I have discussed it. We know you can't help it. It's the background, the instability of your origins. But for one evening, could you try? For the family? I held the phone away from my ear, looked at it as if it were a strange artifact from a civilization I didn't understand. For the family. The family that had lied to me for 28 years. The family that had taken my inheritance and called it charity. The family that was about to discover that their entire existence rested on foundations I owned. Of course, Mother, I said. For the family. I hung up, opened my closet, looked at the navy dress, the one she'd chosen, the one that made me invisible, the one that said "Grateful Charity Case" in every seam. Then I reached to the back, to the garment bag I'd bought myself, with money I'd saved from clinic work, from tutoring, from the small life I'd built in the shadow of their wealth. The dress was black, not navy, not invisible. Black like authority, like finality, like the space between stars where no light escaped. Backless, sleeveless, the kind of dress that announced presence rather than requested permission. The kind of dress my mother would hate, my father would ignore, Victoria would mock. The kind of dress a woman wore when she was done being grateful. The Whitmore estate glowed like a weapon. 40 rooms, 3 gardens, a ballroom that could hold 200 with space for dancing. My father had bought it in 2008, or so I'd always believed. The peak of his success, the symbol of his arrival, the fortress from which he conducted his empire. Now I knew the truth. He hadn't bought it at all. He'd leased it from a shell company that reported to a holding firm that reported to a trust that reported to me. For 11 years, he'd paid rent to himself without knowing it, had maintained a house he didn't own, had built a life on foundations that could be removed with a single signature. I arrived at 7:45, fashionably late, though my mother would call it disrespectful. The valet took my car, a Honda I'd bought used, the car that marked me as different from the Mercedes and BMWs filling the circular drive. I didn't care. In 48 hours, at midnight on my birthday, the Honda would be replaced by whatever I chose. But tonight, I wanted the contrast. Wanted the reminder of who I'd been, who they'd made me, who I was leaving behind. The ballroom was full. 80 guests, maybe more. The cream of my father's world. Lawyers, judges, politicians, the occasional celebrity whose presence validated the host more than the guest. I recognized most of them from childhood, from the parties where I'd been introduced as our adopted daughter, Eleanor, from the gatherings where I'd learned to stand at the edges, to smile without engaging, to be present without being seen. Victoria was at the center. Of course she was. 26 years old, blonde like our mother, beautiful in the way that cost money and intention. The emerald dress caught the light, made her glow like a jewel, announced her status before she spoke a word. She was holding court near the champagne fountain, surrounded by young men who would inherit their father's firms, young women who would marry them, the endless cycle of wealth validating wealth. She saw me. Her smile flickered, adjusted, became the performance she used for public consumption. "Eleanor, you came. Mother was so worried you'd—" She glanced at my dress, the black that absorbed the light her emerald reflected. "Find something appropriate." "I found something," I said. "Clearly." She laughed, the sound designed to include nearby listeners, to establish hierarchy, to remind everyone that she was the star and I was the understudy. "But it's fine. Tonight isn't about fashion. It's about family, about legacy, about—" She touched my arm, the gesture intimate and condescending, recognizing where we belong. I smiled. The smile I'd practiced for 2 years, the one that reached my eyes without warming them, the one that said everything and nothing. Exactly, Victoria. Recognizing where we belong. The dinner was interminable. 7 courses, each announced with the gravity of a royal decree, each consumed with the performative appreciation of people who'd never known hunger. I sat at the far end of the long table, between a state senator's wife who'd forgotten my name 3 times and a venture capitalist who kept trying to look down my dress. My father sat at the head, my mother at his right, Victoria at his left. The Holy Trinity, the core family, the unit I orbited like a distant planet. Occasionally my mother would glance my way, her eyes narrowing in assessment, checking that I was still in position, still playing my role, still grateful. I was grateful. Grateful for the water stain on my apartment ceiling that had taught me resilience. Grateful for the radiators clanking that had taught me to sleep through chaos. Grateful for every moment of invisibility that had allowed me to plan, to prepare, to become dangerous without anyone noticing. The dessert arrived, some kind of architectural chocolate that required explanation, and my father stood. The room quieted instantly, the way rooms always quieted for Richard Caldwell, with the deference due to power rather than the respect due to character. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying without effort, the voice of a man who'd spent 40 years being listened to. "Family. Tonight we celebrate something rare, something precious. The continuation of a legacy." He raised his glass. The crowd raised theirs. I raised mine, the gesture automatic, mechanical. 30 years ago, I made a decision. A difficult decision. To open my home, my heart, my family to a child who needed— He paused, the dramatic beat he'd perfected in courtrooms. Guidance. Structure. The kind of upbringing that only a family like ours could provide. I felt the shift in the room. The subtle turning of attention, the awareness that something was happening, that the speech had turned toward territory usually avoided at polite gatherings. "Eleanor," my father said, and now he was looking at me, really looking, his eyes cold with something that might have been triumph. "Our adopted daughter, who came to us from—" Another pause, longer this time, uncertain circumstances, whose biological parents, whatever their virtues, could not provide the stability, the values, the foundation that every child deserves. The room was silent. 80 people watching me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for the performance of gratitude that would validate the narrative. "Tonight," my father continued, "we recognize Victoria, the true heir, the blood of our blood, the future of our name, and Eleanor." He smiled, the expression that had convinced juries and intimidated opponents. "We acknowledge your place, the place we've given you, the place you've earned through—" He laughed, a small sound, intimate, cruel. "Well, through our generosity, primarily. Through our willingness to see past your origins. To raise you as our own even when—" He shrugged. "Even when you weren't." My mother was smiling. Victoria was glowing. The room held its breath, waiting for my response, waiting for tears or gratitude, or the humble acceptance that would complete the scene. I set down my glass, the sound of crystal on china, sharp and final. "Thank you, Father," I said. My voice carried, the acoustics of the ballroom catching it, amplifying it, making it impossible to ignore. "For that generous acknowledgement. But I think there's something you don't know. Something none of you know." My father's smile flickered. "Eleanor, this isn't the time." "You're right," I interrupted. "It isn't the time for performances. For fictions. For the lies you've told so long you've started to believe them." I reached into my clutch, the small bag that held everything I needed. "You called me adopted. You called me charity. You called me grateful. And I was. Grateful for the roof, the food, the education. Grateful for the chance to become invisible, to learn your world without being seen, to prepare for exactly this moment." I pulled out the envelope. Thick, legal, the kind of document that changed lives. "What is that?" My father's voice had changed, gained an edge, the tone he used for hostile witnesses. This, I said, is the truth. The truth you hid. The truth my biological parents, Sarah and Michael Vance, made sure I'd eventually learn. They didn't abandon me, Father. They didn't give me up because they couldn't provide. They died. In a car accident. When I was 11 months old. And they left me everything. I opened the envelope, pulled out the first document, held it up for the room to see. This is my birth certificate. Eleanor Sarah Vance. Born to Sarah and Michael Vance. Not adopted, not Charity, their daughter, their only child. I paused, let the words settle. And this, I pulled out another document, is the adoption certificate you and Mother arranged. The fiction, the performance, the lie that let you hide your affair, your illegitimate child, your shame. My mother's face had gone white. Victoria's hand was at her throat, her emerald dress suddenly too bright, too loud, too desperate for attention. You were never my father, I continued, my voice steady, calm, the voice of a woman who'd rehearsed this moment for 2 years. Not biologically. You were my mother's husband, who couldn't keep his vows, who got his mistress pregnant, who watched her die and decided the easiest solution was to pretend I was someone else's problem, someone else's charity case. I walked toward the head of the table, each step deliberate, each movement claiming space that had never been offered. But here's what you didn't know. What you couldn't know, because Sarah and Michael Vance were smarter than you. They established a trust. $50 million. Real estate. Corporate holdings. Assets that grew while you deducted my allowance and called it generosity. I reached my father. Stood before him, close enough to smell his cologne, to see the fear in his eyes, to watch the mask of authority crack and fall away. The Whitmore estate, I said. You bought it in 2008? No. You leased it. From Caldwell Holdings, LLC, which is owned by Vance Family Trust, which is controlled by me. I pulled out another document, the deed, the proof. I've owned this house since 2019. You've been paying me rent for 5 years. Through intermediaries you never bothered to investigate. My father's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No sound emerged. And Caldwell Industries, I continued. Your empire. Your legacy. 73% of outstanding shares. Acquired in 2015. By a subsidiary of a subsidiary. Of me. I smiled. The expression I'd never shown him, the one that held no warmth, no need, no gratitude. You've been CEO for 10 years, Father. But you've been working for me. Reporting to a board I control. Drawing a salary I approve. Building a legacy. I laughed, the sound sharp and final. That was never yours. The room was frozen. 80 people, witnesses to a destruction they'd never expected, participants in a drama they didn't understand. I turned to my mother, to the woman who'd adopted me, who'd raised me to be grateful, who'd watched my father humiliate me and called it character building. You knew, I said, not everything, not the trust, the money, the ownership. But you knew I wasn't adopted. You knew I was his. You accepted me. The word tasted like poison, because the alternative was scandal, because appearances mattered more than truth, because it was easier to raise your husband's bastard as a charity case than to acknowledge what he'd done. My mother's face crumpled, the careful mask of composure dissolving into something raw and ugly. Eleanor, please. Don't. The word cut through her plea like a blade. Don't Eleanor me, don't please me, don't pretend there's love here, or family, or anything worth saving. I looked around the room, at the faces I'd known since childhood, the people who'd watched my humiliation and called it entertainment. You wanted a celebration of legacy. Here it is, the Caldwell legacy, built on lies, maintained by fraud, sustained by the labor of a woman you called worthless. I turned back to my father, to the man who'd commanded this room, this family, this life, and was now discovering that he'd never owned any of it. 30 days, I said. You, Mother, Victoria, you have 30 days to vacate my property, to find new employment, to build lives that don't depend on my generosity. I paused. Let the number settle. Or I can simply terminate your positions, close the accounts, sell the assets, reduce your world to exactly what you had before you decided to raise your mistress's child as a pet. Victoria made a sound, something between a sob and a scream. You can't. This is my home, my life. Your life, I repeated, built on my money, maintained by my silence, sustained by my invisibility. I looked at her, really looked, at the sister who'd never been my sister, the heir who'd inherited nothing but performance. You wanted to be the star, Victoria. Congratulations. You are. The star of a show that's just been cancelled. I walked to the door. 80 people watched me go, and this time, for the first time, I wasn't invisible. I was the center, the gravity, the force that bent the room around me. At the door, I paused. Looked back at my father, still standing at the head of the table, his glass raised in a toast that would never be completed. One more thing, I said. The navy dress? The one Mother chose? I didn't wear it. I smoothed the black silk, the dress that announced rather than requested. This is mine. Everything I have, everything I am, everything I've built, it's mine. And for the first time in 30 years, I'm not grateful. I'm just done. I left. The door closed behind me with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Harold Chen arrived at 9 a.m., not at the Whitmore estate. I hadn't returned there, would never return there except as owner conducting an inspection. He came to my apartment, the one with the water stain and the clanking radiator, the one that suddenly felt like a costume I'd outgrown. Miss Vance, he said, settling onto my thrift store couch with the ease of a man who'd managed billion-dollar portfolios from worse furniture. Or do you prefer Caldwell? Vance, I said. Eleanor Vance. The name my parents gave me. The name I'll use from now on. He nodded, pulled out his briefcase, began arranging documents on my coffee table. The trust activated at midnight, as expected. Funds are available, accounts are liquid, assets are transferable. I've prepared a summary of immediate holdings. I know the holdings, I interrupted. I spent 2 years learning them. What I need now is execution. The eviction notices, the board changes, the termination of employment contracts. Harold paused, looked at me with the expression of a man who'd seen many things in his career, who'd guided many young people through sudden wealth, who'd learned to recognize the difference between vengeance and justice. May I speak frankly? Please. What you're describing, evicting your family, terminating their employment, removing their support systems, it's legal. Completely. You own the assets, you control the decisions, you have every right. But, he held up a hand, stopping my interruption. But it's also irreversible. Once done, it can't be undone. And I've found, in my experience, that the people who act immediately, who let anger drive their decisions, often regret the speed more than the substance. I sat across from him, in the chair that had been my father's before I'd claimed it from the estate sale, and considered his words. He wasn't wrong. The anger was there, hot and bright. The rage of 30 years of being told I was less than, of being made to feel grateful for my own diminishment. But beneath the anger, something else. Something colder, more precise, more durable. It's not anger, I said finally. It's architecture. My father, Richard, built a life on foundations he didn't own. He raised a family in a house he leased from me. He built a career as CEO of a company I controlled. He performed generosity while extracting value. And now, I paused, found the right words. Now I'm removing the props. Not because I hate him, because the structure is unsound. Because it was always going to collapse. I'm just choosing when. Harold nodded. The nod of a man who understood, who'd seen similar calculations before, who recognized the difference between impulse and intention. Then let's proceed, he said, methodically, document by document, decision by decision. I'll guide you through each step, explain the implications, ensure you understand before you sign. He paused, looked at me with something that might have been respect. Your parents, your biological parents, would be proud. They structured this trust to protect you from exactly this moment, from people who would take what was yours and call it charity. They wanted you to have the knowledge, the power, the time to make informed choices. And you have. I looked around my apartment. At the water stain, the radiator, the life I'd built in the shadow of their wealth. In 48 hours, I could replace all of it. Could buy penthouses, mansions, islands. Could become the person my father had pretended to be, the wealthy, the powerful, the commanding. But I didn't want to replace it. Not yet. The apartment was a reminder, a monument, a proof of what I'd survived, of who I'd been before I knew who I was. Harold, I said, one more thing. The adoption, the fiction my father created. Is there legal recourse? For the fraud, the deception, the years of misrepresentation? He considered. The statute of limitations on some claims may have expired, but the documentation of fraud, the forged adoption certificate, the misrepresentation of your status, the financial implications, that could support civil action. For damages. For recovery of funds improperly obtained. For, he paused, chose his words, punitive measures. File it, I said. All of it. Not because I need the money, because I need the record, the proof, the final documentation that his legacy was built on lies, and that the truth came from the daughter he called worthless. Harold gathered his papers, returned them to his briefcase, stood to leave. At the door, he paused. Ms. Vance, Eleanor, may I ask, what will you do? With the money, the power, the life that's now yours. I looked at the window, at the city beyond, at the future unfolding like a map I'd only just been given permission to read. I don't know yet, I said, but I know what I won't do. I won't perform gratitude for things that were already mine. I won't apologize for existing. I won't let anyone make me small again. I turned to him, smiled the smile that was finally, truly mine. And I think I'll start by fixing the radiator. He laughed, the sound surprising both of us, and left me alone in my apartment, with my documents, with my future. They didn't leave quietly. Of course they didn't. People like my father, like Richard, I corrected myself, the name feeling strange and liberating, didn't accept defeat with grace. They fought, appealed, threatened, negotiated. They hired lawyers who discovered that the law was on my side. They made phone calls to judges who owed me favors they didn't know they owed. They tried leverage they didn't have against power they'd never understood. Victoria called first. 3 days after the party, her voice hoarse with crying or screaming or both. Ellie, please, you can't do this. This is my home, my life, everything I know. Your home, I repeated, that you never paid for. Your life, that you never earned. Everything you know, built on my silence, my invisibility, my willingness to be less so. You could be more. That's not fair. Fair? I laughed, the sound without warmth. You stood there, Victoria, at the party, in your emerald dress, while he called me adopted, while he called me charity, while he performed my humiliation for 80 people you wanted to impress. You smiled. You glowed. You accepted your crown. And now, I paused. Let the silence work. Now you want me to be fair? She hung up. Or I did. The details didn't matter. What mattered was the boundary. Finally drawn, finally defended, finally real. My mother called next. A week later, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the performance that had sustained her for decades. Eleanor, I know you're angry. I know you have every right to be. But please, can't we talk? Can't I explain? Explain what? That you knew? That you accepted your husband's bastard into your home and called it adoption? That you watched him humiliate me for 30 years and called it character building? What exactly do you want to explain, Mother? I was scared, she whispered. When I found out about the affair, the pregnancy, I was terrified. Of scandal, of losing everything, of being the woman whose husband— She stopped, the words catching. Whose husband didn't want her enough to be faithful. So I made a deal. I would raise you as my own. I would protect the family. And in exchange, he would never see your mother again. He would never— She laughed, a broken sound. He would never remind me of what he'd done. I held the phone, silent, processing. The revelation didn't change my decision, didn't soften my resolve, but it added dimension, complexity. The understanding that my mother, too, had been trapped in a structure she hadn't designed, performing a role she hadn't chosen. That doesn't excuse it, I said finally. Your fear doesn't excuse my diminishment. Your deal doesn't obligate my forgiveness. You had choices, Mother. Every day for 30 years, you had choices. And you chose, consistently, deliberately, to make me feel like less, to call me grateful, to remind me that I was charity, not family, not blood, not enough. I know, she said. I know, and I'm— Don't, I interrupted. Don't say you're sorry. Don't ask for forgiveness. Don't perform remorse now that the power has shifted. Just— I paused, found the words. Just leave. Take what you can carry. Find a life that doesn't depend on my generosity. And maybe, someday, if you actually do the work, the therapy, the honesty, the accountability, maybe then we can talk. But not now. Not while you're still performing. She left. They all left eventually. Richard last of all, the man who'd commanded rooms and controlled narratives, now reduced to packing boxes in a house he no longer owned, supervised by movers who reported to me. I didn't watch. Didn't need to. The eviction was legal, documented, final. The house was mine. The company was mine. The life I'd been denied was finally, completely, irrevocably mine. But I didn't move in. Not to the Whitmore estate, with its 40 rooms and its gardens and its memories of humiliation. Not to any of the properties I owned, the penthouses and vacation homes and investment properties that Harold managed with quiet efficiency. I stayed in my apartment, fixed the radiator, repainted the ceiling, bought furniture that was mine, chosen by me, paid for by me. Built a life that was small, deliberate, authentic. And from that base, that foundation, that proof of who I'd been and who I'd become, I started to build. The clinic was busier than I'd expected. Not my old clinic. That was still there, still serving the community I'd been part of, still doing the work that mattered. But this was new. A legal aid foundation, funded by the Vance Family Trust, dedicated to helping people who'd been lied to, manipulated, made to feel small by systems and families and structures that profited from their diminishment. We helped adopted children find their biological parents. We helped exploited workers recover stolen wages. We helped people like me, people who'd been told they were charity cases, who'd been made to feel grateful for their own oppression, who'd been convinced that their value depended on someone else's generosity. I worked there 3 days a week. Not because I needed to. The trust generated income faster than I could spend it. But because I needed the work, the purpose, the reminder that money wasn't the point, that power was only valuable when it was used to protect rather than punish. The other days, I managed the trust, the properties, the investments, the empire that had grown from my biological parents' caution and my own determination. Harold had retired, gracefully, on his own terms, with a pension that ensured his comfort. And his replacement was a young woman named Sarah, who shared my mother's name, but none of her fear. Victoria reached out once, 6 months after the eviction. An email, carefully composed, asking to meet. I declined. Not out of anger. The anger had cooled, calcified, become something else. A boundary. A recognition that some relationships couldn't be repaired, that some damage couldn't be undone, that some people were safer at a distance. Richard tried legal action, of course. Sued for wrongful termination, for emotional distress, for the various indignities that powerful men claim when their power is removed. The cases were dismissed, one, by judges who understood that justice wasn't the same as comfort, that legality wasn't the same as morality, that the man who'd built his life on fraud couldn't claim protection from its exposure. He lived now in a condo in Florida, funded by a pension he'd earned during the years he worked for me. Small, by his previous standards. Modest. The kind of life he'd have had if he'd been honest, if he'd told the truth about my origins, if he'd raised me as his daughter rather than his charity case. Sometimes I wondered if he regretted it. The lies, the performance, the humiliation at the party that had triggered his destruction. But regret required self-awareness, and Richard had spent 40 years constructing a self that couldn't acknowledge fault. So I stopped wondering, stopped caring, stopped giving him space in my mind that he hadn't earned. My mother was different. She'd done the work, the therapy, the honesty, the slow, painful process of accountability. We'd met twice, in neutral spaces, with mediators present. She'd apologized, really apologized, without performance or expectation. Had acknowledged her complicity, her choices, her failure to protect me from the man she'd married. I hadn't forgiven her. Forgiveness was a journey, not a destination, and I was still traveling. But I'd stopped hating her. Had started to see her as a person rather than a villain, a woman who'd made terrible choices from terrible fear, who'd spent decades performing strength because she'd never felt safe being weak. Maybe someday we'd have a relationship. Maybe we wouldn't. The possibility was enough, for now. The openness, without obligation. The boundary, without cruelty. On my 31st birthday, I threw a party. Small, 20 people. Friends rather than connections. People who'd known me before and after, who'd witnessed the transformation without demanding performance. We ate pizza and drank cheap wine and laughed until my ribs hurt, the kind of laughter that comes from safety rather than defense. At midnight, I stepped onto the balcony of my apartment. Still my apartment. Still the water-stained ceiling and the fixed radiator and the life I'd built rather than inherited. I looked at the city, at the lights, at the future unfolding in every direction. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, my assistant, with the day's numbers. The foundation had helped 47 people this month. The investments had returned 12%. The properties were maintained, the employees paid, the systems functioning. And below that, a personal note. Happy birthday, Ellie. Your parents, all of them, would be proud. I thought about that. About Sarah and Michael Vance, who'd died before I could know them, who'd structured a trust to protect me from exactly the people who'd claimed to love me. About Richard and Patricia Caldwell, who'd raised me in lies and called it family. About myself, the girl who'd believed she was Charity and the woman who'd learned she was Air. Proud. The word settled into me, found a place, became part of the architecture. I was proud. Of the foundation, the work, the boundaries. Of the apartment and the radiator and the life that was small and real and mine. Of the choice to use power for protection rather than punishment, to build rather than destroy, to become something other than what had been done to me. The city breathed around me, indifferent and beautiful, and I breathed with it. Eleanor Vance, daughter of Sarah and Michael, survivor of Richard and Patricia, builder of something new. Not grateful, not anymore, just present, just alive, just finally, completely, irrevocably free.